What have we here, you ask? Brussels sprouts, a whole bunch of them. Got to be at least a pound and a half, or maybe even more. There's going to be the side to yesterday's pork chops dinner, except start looking at them, they're covered in little black dots, and it looks like something got in there. So it just seemed safer to throw it in the freezer overnight. And since some of my worm bins were going to need some food today anyway, kind of a shame for this many fresh veggies to not be able to be eaten, but luckily they still have a purpose. Even though they're not going to go in the trash, they're going to get composted. So the worm bins of mine that need feeding today are the youngest, which is 49 days old at this point. It's already received 8 feedings. This will be its 9th. And the other one over there on the right hand, that's now at day 80, and that bin's received 10 feedings. This will be its 11th feeding. But before we get to feeding these bins, I've also got some coffee here. Before we get to feeding those bins, we're going to also just do one other thing. I've got a tub up here. This is what I'm referring to as one of my finishing tubs, and in my finishing tubs I place compost that I consider to be more or less finished. And it also means that the material has for the most part been depopulated of worms too. So that was accomplished through migrating them out and removing them and so on and so forth. So this finishing stage, as I refer to it, is a stage where I allow some time for cocoons to hatch out, and for any worms that emerge from those cocoons to be rounded up, kept in my worm farm, relocated, and then we start considering this as really a true finished batch of compost. So before we head over to feeding my other bins, we're going to see if we can extract any worms from this container here. Let's get a little closer in. It's been 8 days now since we reloaded the bait box in here, and when I say bait box, it's basically one of these. Same thing. This is the end of it where you connect it up to the pond pump, and then within it you've got some filter material. So it's just this lower cage portion of it with the large openings on both sides that we're using as our baiting boxes. It's a good sturdy box, and the worms can certainly sense there's food in it. Since our aim is to relocate any worms that we encounter, we might as well grab them before they vanish out of view. I mean, right off the bat, I did spot a couple. I believe one of them was right here. All right, he's covered, so he's not going to try to flee any further. Once we uncover that, we'll have a little bit more action happening here. So let's get this glove on so we can proceed. So now those of you who were paying really close attention, who might have noticed this between last time we were in this bin and now, is that the plastic that was covering the middle here was a lot smaller than it was when we last fed this bin and we covered it up. Last time we baited this box here, we did spread the plastic out across the entire top of the bin. But since then, I've been in here one time to try to see if there was anything I could do to help it along in the process. And the one thing that I did was I did add a little bit more food into the bait box, and I did add a little bit of bedding to go along with that food too, and it really just consisted of some of this paper that's covering it up. So the other thing that we'll normally do here is really quickly try to see if we spot any worms that are kind of right on the edge of the material, haven't made it right into the box yet. So when we pull this out, our first priority will be to check those little guys. But you know, just to finish the thought from earlier, when I was in here a few days ago, not only did I refresh what was in here, and then I also took a little bit of time at that point to try try to air out the material, try to crumble it all up and get some air pockets throughout. So the one thing I'm noticing here right off the bat is that, yeah, I might have a couple worms here and there, ones that are big enough for me to just reach out and grab and throw into our baiting box. But the other thing I'm noticing here is just an abundance of really, really tiny worms. And I believe, you know, as I mentioned earlier, that's one of the main purposes of letting this bin just continue. It's so that, look at it, baby worms, baby worms, baby worms everywhere. If you just slow down long enough to look, you'll see them all over the place. And then here's also just a couple more cocoons, fairly dark in color, that, you know, just based on that color would tell me that these are probably on the verge of hatching too. So besides worms here that are, you know, maybe already a week or two old, like this one, has already had a few meals and is growing at a nice pace. There's also right next to it a really, really itsy bitsy skinny one. And then alongside all of that, there's even smaller ones everywhere. So that's really a good sign. It's really doing exactly what we had hoped. This was almost the exact timing, too, that we would have anticipated these cocoons to be hatching. And then here and there you just get into a more dense little chunk, which got some extra moisture in it, probably because there's a piece of food remaining there. And then that also gets a lot of attention from these little tiny baby worms. Wow, they're everywhere. So clearly there's no option here to just pick a couple out of the material. I think we've really got sort of an entire wave of new hatchlings coming online here. And I believe the only real sensible thing for us to do is just to give this more time for the worms to eventually start wanting to work their way out of all this finished casting material and then over into a slightly more appealing space. I'm not sure how many worms to expect if we dump this out, but why don't we just go ahead and see what we wound up with here. I do see a couple more at the very bottom. Let's see if I could fish them out. We've got a whole generation of babies to try to round up here, if possible. So within this little bundle of bedding and food material, we're finding a variety of different size worms. A couple good sized ones, plus a bunch of little baby ones as well. So we'll just take this little collection of baited worms that we've got here and we'll include it in the first feeding. We'll start with the youngest of my bins, the 49-day-old bin. When we load that up with this feeding, we'll go ahead and we'll include this haul bomb. We'll start assembling the bait bomb right now, just so we can get it out of our way. So yeah, we're not going to fish around for more worms. We're not going to take the time for that. We're just going to let this continue as it's been. Give them a little bit more time for those remaining dark colored cocoons to hatch out. We'll have even more babies squirming around in this material. So let's set up a little space that's going to draw their attention once they get out and they start exploring and looking for food sources. It seemed to me like placing a few chunks of this tattered paper on the bottom as bedding is a really good material. It's already soaked in juices and foods and is pretty far along. It just almost melts in your hand, melts in your mouth for the worms, I guess. And we'll keep a little bit of it so we could try to cover up our bait station with something at least. We'll just get the more tattered little bits and pieces out of there. I'm going to take a banana peel as well as a couple more fibrous food items like this piece of a veggie. I know that those always seem to take a while to break down. This way they'll have food that they can really kind of take their time on, and it won't break down right away. We'll be able to see slow progress of that material as they start consuming it. So it'll probably also hopefully mean that we don't have to reload this thing too much the next time. Hopefully the next time we will have rounded up a good large number of baby worms, and maybe we'll be pretty close to considering this material as evacuated. Alright, so Definitely like the way this stuff is coming along. If I was, really impatient and wanting this stuff to be done already so that I could use the castings in my garden, then I'd be chomping at the bit because the material is really fine. It's got a fair amount of moisture to it still too. So whenever I get in here, I do like to air it out a little bit. It's also a great opportunity to see what the worm population looks like. I've got plenty of good-sized worms out here on this far edge. I'm not going to see many babies, but we saw a whole bunch of them cruising around the extra damp material that surrounded the baiting box. This side of the material seems almost a little bit drier, seems a little bit more crumbly. Okay, I think we're pretty much there. We'll just create a little pit for this little box down here in the middle. I keep seeing cocoons all over the place. Besides the little babies that I've seen so far, we're going to just see so many more. So at 35 days of finishing action so far, it certainly seems like we've got a whole bunch of babies about to erupt onto the scene to help with the further breakdown of this material. And it's really fine material. It's all, for the most part, finished castings, but there's always an abundance of, stuff littered in that. All kinds of food scraps. So we'll just cover up here and get this thing back up on the shelf. Looks really good. I guess leaving the outside of this uncovered the way it was with this reduced size plastic. All I did was I folded in the existing plastic that was placed here previously just to give it less of a surface area to allow more of this to be exposed to the air to dry. And I think as we get more dry material on the top, we can continue to mix it together with the more damp stuff down deep, and we'll eventually come up with some material that's got a really nice moisture content. All right, day 35 of my finishing tub. All right, let's get on to feeding and to releasing the captured worms. I almost forgot, since in that finishing tub we're expecting baby worms. The baby worms are going to need some grit to be able to eat any of that food, so make sure I put some of that in there. I'm not going to bring the tub back out here, but I'm going to take care of that now and then we'll continue. So this 49-day-old bin is my youngest bin, but it's certainly not a young bin anymore. Month and a half old. We just want to be careful not to end up lifting a whole bunch of worms off. It's incredible though. Look at all those castings. Castings everywhere. We've just been laying it out everywhere, just big huge chunks of it. I mean, last thing we did was we covered things up here. So none of this casting material would have been here yet. It's incredible too how they just demolished this sheet of paper. I mean, it's not just one sheet of paper. It wasn't really one sheet of paper anymore. It was a number of sheets of paper, like pieces of a puzzle. But it's been eroded probably by a good 50% more. So there's only just little paper scraps anymore. I think we took some of the paper scraps that we had collected even earlier and just used it to cover up with last time we fed. Some of these pieces look like they're even in better shape than what we were using before. I like to try to reclaim some of this bedding if I can, and reuse it instead of putting fresh bedding in there. Let them keep working the existing bedding until it's all broken down. So it's been 7 days. 7 days since we last fed this bin. It's a pretty busy bin. It's got a number of things in here. It's like the place where we dump all the slow composting items, like right here, mango seed, very slow composting item. I think we've got a pumpkin stem in here. There's all kinds of stuff in here, which is going to just take a long time to kind of cool to see a variety of different sized worms hanging out all over the pumpkin stem and now down within the pumpkin stem. Very, very busy bin. I was questioning whether I should consider this as a highly populated bin. I was kind of considering all of my current red wiggler bins as being highly populated. I just sort of anticipated a greater number of worms being placed in here than what I ended up putting in here, although I could be completely flawed in my estimate of how much of a population there is in here. There could be a lot more than I'm expecting or thinking. Because every time I do see just large masses of worms in here, I feel like I'm a little bit caught off guard and surprised. Maybe I can't officially consider this as a very densely populated bin, just like the rest of my bins. So I guess all I'm doing here is pushing things to the side one way or the other, both ways. I guess that ultimately ends up with a little bit kind of an elevated top surface in the end. At some point we would have to just decide how high do we want to go before we start to overflow and spill out of this container. So this container, like my other ones, might be ready for the next stage of the feeding, which I treat all of the feeding as sort of going through a steady, continuous feeding period. And then at some point, just a halt to ongoing feedings, but in that time, they're still eating all the food that they'd received and just breaking down all the remaining bits. So that's kind of like a resting period, so to speak. No fresh food, but there should be plenty of food scraps to sustain the worms for quite a while once I decide it's time to get to that stage. So I'm thinking a couple more feedings and we're going to be at capacity in this bin, so it might be time to start thinking about getting this bin ready for its last feeding. Maybe one or two more feedings, we'll see how it goes. And before we start, we're going to take these little guys that we collected out of our baiting boxes in our finishing tub. Check out how we did. It's always easiest to see how many we got in here if we sort of spread it all out quickly after we dump it. Hopefully we get to see a few of them before they squirm out of view. It's a variety of different sized worms here, all kinds of little itsy bitsy ones. Here's a few fairly large, mature sized ones. And there's little bits of the food remaining in here. Looks like celery and carrots and stuff like that. But look at that, the worms are almost all gone already. I only see a couple, and they'll be out of view momentarily as well. So I'm going to add this feeding. I guess we'll throw in a little bit of grit. Nice little intermediate layer between the coffee and the food. Oh no, a whole bunch of Brussels sprouts. Okay. If you've been following along, then you'll know that I've been sticking to something of a sort of a handful dosage or handful measurement. In the past, I've given either one or two handfuls, at least the past few feedings. Since I've got so much stuff here, and since I think they're going to go through this pretty quickly because it's a fairly soft, gushy kind of material, especially when this stuff starts to thaw out after it's been frozen, I think we can spare one more little something. I'm going to drop in a third handful of Brussels sprouts. What a feast. Lucky worms. Alright, so here's a lot of recycled bedding material. Just tattered. Bedding and food all right there next to each other. So I got this piece. I don't know what it's going to look like once we unfold it, but it looks like it's holding up pretty good, so it seems to be in a single piece still. So we'll just take some of this chunky stuff that I can rake off the top. So I'll take all of this loose, large chunk material that I was able to scrape off and use that to cover up with. Try to get all these little chunks of stuff that are off on the side right into the middle where all the feeding's occurring, where all the action is. See if we can collect some of that stuff from here too. Wow, this material is so nice. I'm at this point just pulling a little bit of the finished compost from the side over to really give ourselves a decent cover up over the feeding. But I got a feeling a bin with this sort of a population, they seem pretty plentiful and they seem pretty hungry. I got a feeling they're going to put a pretty good dent into that supply of Brussels sprouts in no time. What nice stuff. Yeah, I think this bin is getting pretty close to being ready. Ready for a little starvation period. Let it work down all the remaining bits and pieces that are in here, so we get a tub of some really beautiful material. I'm just going to go ahead and throw one more fresh piece of paper right there, just in case that piece that's in there now ends up getting really gobbled up. Still see that the middle is where we had last fed. Pretty sloppy here with these plastic sheets. Doing what I can to not make a huge mess all over the place. Luckily the castings that end up on things all air dry pretty quickly and can just be, brushed off. If you try brushing it off now while it's still a little bit damp, you can end up just smearing it and making a bigger mess than necessary. So sometimes it's easier to let the mess remain until it's dried out, and then cleaning it up. All right, let's go feed the last bin. Okay, so no releasing of worms here. We've done our migration and reset of the baiting. So here all we got to do is feed. Sure, I've got only one piece of plastic doing the covering. Almost seems like a more convenient way where you can try to just contain the mess in one place. Wow, look at that. Now this is a very, very heavily populated bin. And something I never ever see in my bins is just an abundance of this much beautiful castings material all over the top surface. It's like if it had just snowed worm castings. That's what it looks like. It's awesome. I mean, if the whole bin is made up of stuff like this, then this bin might be ready for migration too. And that's kind of where we're going with these bins. I mean, sometimes you want to go over 100 days to really wind down, but when you've got heavily populated bins like these, then they just burn through what they're given so quickly. You probably do have to consider harvesting pretty soon after you've launched the bin. I've occasionally referred to this bin as possibly my best bin ever, and it was probably the bin launched with the greatest number of worms ever as well. I mean, I'm estimating thousands and thousands of worms in this bin. This bin also has a few slow composting food items in it. These are the sorts of things that I believe if we were to really want this bin to start steering towards completion, then those sort of things might just get pulled out into placed into a bin that's going to be in service for some time longer. So give those materials a greater chance at being broken down. If I were to starve this bin, there's definitely, mango seeds and large chunks of remaining food in here. I can feel it. Lots of sticks, stems from leaves. What do we have at the bottom here? I guess here we've got some of the leftovers from last time. Can't tell what it is. Doesn't really have a scent. The whole bin has just one consistent sort of earthy smell to it, but none of these food scraps are distinguishable by their smell. But most oftentimes you can't. You can't tell what the heck it is. Really busy here. here's a peach pit. If there's a bin in which a peach pit has a chance of being broken down, it's got to be this bin, because this bin is just mobbed. It's more of an experimental item. This will probably go through multiple generations of bins before it finally gets broken down, if it ever gets broken down. Banana stems. So we're still seeing some scraps from previous feedings, including numerous test items, which may never ever break down. Another peach pit. I guess there's more than one. But luckily there's also room for a little bit more food. There's still plenty of bedding down here too, from what I can tell. Gosh, so many worms. It's incredible. Very busy bin. Things do seem a little bit damp down here, but I am covering the whole thing with a piece of plastic, so pretty much no moisture makes its way out. It all collects when it tries to evaporate. It all collects on that plastic and drips right back down into the bin. So all the moisture that was ever added is more or less still in here. Each feeding, the moisture that comes out of each feeding, seems to be working really well for them too. So let's get this bin fed too. Like before, I think we'll just dump in the coffee we've got. That's one less container. Well, it seems like a pretty generous amount, but that's fine. Not going to worry too much about it. I pulled over some things like little pockets of leafy material and cardboard and whatever, little bedding pockets that it seemed like I wanted to try to spread out and sort of unbundle. They were little balls collected together. Give the material a little bit of a better chance at being consumed. I'm just going to dump in the remainder of the Brussels sprouts. Seems like a comparable amount. Pretty much the same amount that we gave the other bin. But I got a feeling that this bin is just a lot more heavily populated, so I think we're probably going to see this stuff get eaten up a lot more quickly than what was added to the other bin. Such nice material. Well, I don't know if there's any sort of bedding we can use to cover up with. I'd like to cover up with something. Use a couple of these coffee filters. They work great. I've got so many of them. Wow. Stuff is really damp, but it's not muddy. It's crumbly, it's soft. I just peel a little bit off the top and right away I'm encountering little pockets of worms right under the surface, almost anywhere you look in this bin. We didn't really examine the outer edges, which is where usually my bins are very dry and inhospitable to worms, but in this case, this plastic covering the whole thing, the material is really, really nice and damp. And it's fully occupied with worms. All busy, all working on every corner of the bin. Might as well take a little glance at how things look under here too. Just with so little space remaining. I'm trying to be very careful so I don't just end up pouring a bunch of castings out onto the table. I can feel them down there. You can feel something squishy squashy, and it's not moisture or water, it's just worms. Incredible. Such a busy bin. And the material is so far along, it does seem like both of these bins should probably be set up for starvation time soon. Let them really focus on the material that's in here now, not be given anything fresh. Start steering this material towards harvesting. Get the worms out of it first. Try to depopulate, migrate. I think this bin's ready for it too. What a nice bin. 80 days. Okay, well, all I've got left to do here at this point is cover up and clean up. There's got another mission accomplished today, which is awesome. And it's always so much fun checking out bins that have this many worms in them. You always feel a little bit surprised to see how much progress they've made in a week's time or 10 days time. So I definitely look forward to being back into this bin to see how things are progressing. I'm really contemplating not feeding any further and starting to send this bin down the path of really finishing off what remains in the bin so we can start thinking about getting the worms migrated out of it. So before I go, really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for coming along and keeping me company. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to give me a quick thumbs up. I really appreciate it. And also consider becoming subscribed to the channel as well. That helps a lot too. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.